live stream up. Label the stream. Chapter 3 will be on when I get this going. Chapter 3. Control V, Chapter 3. And it's a long chapter, but I'm going to try to read all 33 pages, or 32 pages, I think it is. Edgar Allan Poe. The poetry, the poet Edgar Allan Poe, done. Change. Poe, where the hell is it? Did I lose it? Where's this at? It don't look like it. Is that it? It is it. All right. Well, there you go. We shall open this, close that, turn down the sound. What's up, bruv? Open this chat here. Why does this thing take so long to save? All right, we'll open that. Make sure the video is working. Make sure that everything's great, bruv. Wow, 40 people. Whoa. All right, Poe. That looks good. Chat looks good. Turn on the light and we'll start reading this book. Chapter 3. The Poet Edgar Allan Poe, Alien Angel by Jerome McGann. Poetry. All masks for a red death. Caesar, make not your thoughts your prisons, no, dear queen, for we intend so to dispose you, as yourself shall give us counsel, feed and sleep, flourish, excellent Caesar and his train. Cleopatra, he words me, girls, he words me, that I should not be noble to myself. But hark thee, Charmander, we'll just say, whispers Charmian. Iris, finish, good lady, the bright day is done, and we are for the dark. Shakespeare, Antony, and Cleopatra. Winters censures Poe's poetry for its lack of content. The charge can seem preposterous in face of Poe's reception history, to which scholars and readers keep adding further suggestions about the poetry's sources, references, and meanings, and yet, in an important sense, Winters is correct, as that reception history shows, for the language of the poems is not precisely defining, but precisely suggestive. The style works to unhinge both words and syntax from semantic certainty. That is the glory and the nothing of it. The poems illustrate themselves, and in that respect resemble the demonstrations of mathematical theorems. So we rightly say that they are performative rather than expressive. They are organized not by symbolic form, but by cumulative associations. As with Rimbaud, who studied and admired Poe, their images do not refer, they resonate. A nice example of Poe's method comes as the opening stanza of To Helen, a notable crux in his work. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore, that gently o'er a perfumed sea the weary way-worn wanderer bore to his own native shore. We need go no further than Mabbitt's extensive notes to see how the key nominals in the passage have been objects of obsessive inquiry and search. The result is not a consensus about their reference, but an array of alternatives. Taken together, these commentaries become a complex sign of the poem's associational resonance. Hello, Bravs. Yeah. The result is not a consensus about the reference, but an array of alternatives. Taken together, these commentaries become a complex sign of the poem's associational resonance. In that sense, we see the pertinence of James Russell Lowell's remarks that Poe's poem is like a Greek column because of its perfection. Thanks, buddy. The point is not whether the poem is in fact perfect, but that it suggests the idea of perfection by making itself its own subject. And I enunciate my S's on purpose. Papas. This poem, written solely for the poem's sake, addressed to Helen. The poem is also, and at once, a journey to Helen and to her Hellenic world, as well as the means by which the journey is accomplished. Press further, as the poem's complex and problematic resonance invite us to do, that content betrays the dark metastasis that Poe called its undercurrent of meaning. Thanks, bruv. Mournful and never-ending remembrance. Writing poetry in this way turns Poe's poems into a set of demonstrative arguments about poetry itself, more precisely about Poe's theory of poetry. In his most ambitious poetical work, Eureka, he denied that his poetical method, confessedly subjective and imaginative, ought to be called a method of demonstration. His view follows from his commitment to argument by imaginative conceivability, abduction as opposed to inductive or deductive demonstration. It has much in common with Blake's view of poetical imagination, as well as with Keats's thought that what the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth, whether it existed before or not. In this context, Stein's theory of composition as explanation is perhaps the most appropriate way of understanding Poe's poetics. I wish I was Mormon. I could have 50 wives and I won't get into it. His theory is important because it breaks so sharply with tradition. It is neither an ontological nor a psychological theory, both of which, for example, are seriously pursued in Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. Poe's theory is procedural. To know what poetry is, you want to observe how it works. And you only achieve that if, like a scientist investigating electricity, you experiment with its actual resources and possibilities. From that vantage, everything about the poem will appear to be handled impersonally, including the poet him or herself. We observe this quest for impersonality in one of the most notable features of Poe's poetry, its tendency to objectify a poem's first-person address, although the situation resembles the procedure of a dramatic monologue. Ultimately, it is very different. After the early Tamerlane, Poe does not again deploy dramatic monologue. That is, he does not put the words of his poems in the mouths of public speakers, whether historical or literary. But the traditional dramatic monologue wants those referential contexts, historical or intertextual, to shape our sense of what the poem means. Tamerlane itself does anticipate Poe's normal procedure because it is not Tamerlane, whom Poe ventriloquizes, but Byron, as is apparent from the poem's clear source. The famous last words of the Giaour, I don't know how to say that word, in Byron's celebrated poem. Poe's mature poems, however, are not voiced by people, not even by poets like Byron, but by highly imaginative and anonymous characters. The real settings of Poe's poems mark the character of the speakers, though only Israfel, the Raven, and Lenore explicitly identify them as anonymous writers and poets. The Raven and its prose exegesis, the philosophy of composition, put the logic of Poe's design on complete display. Poe dons the mask of a poet craftsman who has constructed the text, in which we observe the spontaneous overflows of an unself-conscious writer tormented by a loss he does not want to remember. While the essay calls our attention to the distinction the poem draws between writer and writer, the poem hides it in plain sight. We register the poem's peculiarly doubled character when we ask ourselves, who claims our interest here, the poetic speaker or the poetic maker? The voice that carries the poem's transparent upper current of meaning, or the voice that is the under or suggestive one? Is this a drama of the making of a poem or of the unmaking of a poem? If we're reading in the same spirit that the author writ, we will be watching both at the same time. Though, or through the making of the poem, the romantic first person is extinguished as an independent character in the field of the poem. The consequence is a reorientation of the distinction between poetic style and poetic content, the distinction that forms the core of Winters's critique. Winters reads this change as the elimination of content from the poem, a move reflective, he thinks, Poe's shallow intelligence. He had a mind for only the crudest of distinctions, but what Poe has actually done is to expose the crudity of Winters's traditional distinction. Winters treats a poem's style, its language and versification, as a vehicle for some kind of referent or content for a person, the poet, a character, the first-person speaker in The Raven, an idea, a setting, a narrated or specified action. In Poe's poems, that transactional model of language is refused, just as Poe in his critique of Charles Babbage's Ninth Bridgewater Treatise refuses the transactional model of cause and effect as an adequate account of the action in the world. What is cause and what is effect depend on the point of view because, as Poe argues, cause and effect are codependent functions. Poe's poetic moves have large implications for our understanding of the ethics of his poetry. This is very clear from the historical reactions against his aestheticism and art for art's sake. Winters's essay is a signal instance of those reactions. But the ethical questions won't be clearly engaged, I think, until we see exactly how Poe expels a transactional model of language from his poems. Consider the following passages. Lo, in yon brilliant window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the agate lamp within thy hand, ah, Psyche, from the religious regions which are Holy Land, to Helen. How many scenes of what departed bliss, how many thoughts of what entombed hopes, how many visions of a maiden that is no more. Sonnet to Zante. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more. The Raven, of course. In all three passages, certain rhymes are so bizarre, niche, witch, bliss, that is, and the most startling of all, that is lattice, thereat is. That's fucking brilliant, thereat is. Thereat is, profs. As to fix our attention on the words. I'm pretty sure he was probably just ripped and was fucking laughing his ass off writing it. Couldn't think of a word, so he just put thereat is. As to fix our attention on the words and how they sound in our mind's ear. We only have one ear. And away from their semantic value, rhyming a traditional substantive paradigmatically a noun with an unrelated pronoun or a syntactic phrase, particularly a phrase whose meaning is quite abstract, thereat is erodes the content value of the one and reciprocally assigns substantive force to the abstract action phrase. Or observe into Helen the effect of forcing the weak pronoun which, to carry both rhyme and strong stress across an enjambment at the poem's climatic moment, driven into an unnatural prominence, the word suddenly seems unknown and uncanny, as if escaped from regions which are regions strange. The move transforms the trivial pronoun to a portentous zeugma. What the hell is a zeugma? Zeugma, and as such, to an index of the unimaginable beauty that is the poem's subject. And I stress an index rather than a symbol because the poetic event here is strongly performative. The rhyme indicates that a non normal relation has been made to happen. The consequence is an encounter with a poetical meaning that does not easily yield to an ontological or thematic translation. Poe's poetry is fairly defined by these kinds of effects, which is why Emerson called him the jingle man. Like Winters' judgment, Emerson shows that he has had the experience of Poe's poetry but missed the meaning of the experience. Like Winters, Emerson regards poetry as a vehicle for expressing significant ideas. I mean, in their defense, Poe did say you had to basically live the poem and let the poem speak for itself. So if you heard jingles, that's his fault. As such, they require the reader to interpret what they signify. For Poe, on the contrary, poems are compositions of meaningful experience that require from the reader performance. Here are some further exemplary moments. All beauty sleeps, and lo, where lies Irene with her destinies. So blend the turrets and shadows there that all seem pendulous in air, while from a proud tower in the town death looks gigantically down. But lo, a stir is in the air, the wave, there is a movement there. Yes, and that was from The City and the Sea. Yes, heaven is thine, but this is a world of sweets and sours. Our flowers are merely flowers, and the shadow of thy perfect bliss is the sunshine of ours. Israfel. What world have we entered in the sleeper? The words Irene and destinies are being worked to suggest more than they could commonly name. In this imaginative landscape, the multiple meanings of Irene's name call to her multiple sleeping fatalities. Besides, those are destinies, not destinies, quasi-human beings that appear in forms as substantial as the dream that twice comes to Xerxes, commanding him to invade Greece. Or consider those repeated their rhymes in the city and the sea, the expletive there and the adverb there are worked to map the landscape being created by the poem itself. In each case, the reader confronts words that, however familiar, suggest that another unknown language lies concealed in our common tongue, as the strange adverb gigantically here also shows. When Poe presses the versification to deliver the word to us in 5 rather than 4 syllables, that odd form brings special notice to a word whose meaning here is eluding its syntax. The Haunted Palace has a pair of adverbs that get similarly torqued, though in this case they are paired to indicate that an otherworldly music may echo both harmonic and discordant spheres. The word musically gets estranged because the verse insists that it be read as 4 syllables instead of 3, and with an odd, if clearly called, emphasis on the third syllable that comes to preserve the expected rhyme. Wanderers in that happy valley through 2 luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well-turned law, the haunted palace. Musically here, if strange to our ears is yet well tuned, not so the word fantastically that comes later in the poem to signal how evil things have broken the law of the well-tuned lute. In this case, both syllabification and rhyme are disordered. And travelers now within that valley, through the encrimsoned windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody. While these are unheard melodies in a world of sweets, a world of sweets and sours in another region, out of space, out of time, they are so normal as to resemble the cliches of the unusual lexicon from which Poe draws the language of his poetry. By a route obscure and lonely, haunted by ill angels only, where an eidolon named Night on a black throne reigns upright, I have reached these lands but newly from an ultimate dim. Is that Thule? I'm guessing. I was going to say Thule, but it rhymes with newly, so Thule, from a wild clime that lieth sublime, out of space, out of time, the dreamland. This clime is beyond even the place named as the ultimate region of the known world, Thule, and the indexed again, not the symbol of such a place, is the uncertain pronunciation of the word itself. In our northernmost mortal regions, the Scandinavian world at the edge of Thule, the final vowel of its name, is distinctively pronounced short, so Thule. But as the word descends to the south, the vowel grows longer, though it never truly rhymes with newly, so it must be Thule. Even in the British Isles. Only in America, Poe's America, does such a rhyme emerge as possible, and when it does, as here, the result is as wonderful and uncanny as the opening couplet of the passage. The early poem Al Araf, like Keats's juvenile Endymion, is an anthology of the poet's experimental efforts to write this kind of poetry. Poe's Ars Poetica achieves perhaps its most explicit statement or compositional performance in Nassais's Song to Ligeia in Part 2, where wildflowers creeping have mingled their shade, on its margin is sleeping full many a maid. Some have left the cool glade and have slept with the bee. Arouse them, my maiden, on moorland and lea. Leah or Lee, I don't know. Go, breathe on their slumber, all softly in ear, the musical slumber they slumbered to hear. Al Araf. The music of these things emerges as the unfolding sounds. Shade, maid, glade, and maiden. They signal a poetry of wit, or what Poe called the fancy. Even more pertinent, it is the wit of a sentimental style, not metaphysical or neoclassical. Its defining character appears as the sequence's ultimate rhyme, which comes paradoxically as an invisible but unmistakable presence. It is the unvoiced phrase made and that hovers at the end of the passage, and in the context of the song as a whole, specifies literally its poiesis. Especially remarkable is how this simple rhyme manipulation affects the passage as a whole, implicating other relations, or what Poe calls equalities in the rationale of verse. The unvoiced made and works through the initial rhyme of glade and maid. Glade comes to the aid of maid. The rhyme thus gets mingled as well with an all but explicit synesthesia. The shade cast by the flowers conceals the fragrance that becomes the breath of Ligeia, which transforms the sound heard by the sleeping maidens. These maidens need a drink. Two. In writing this way, Poe was studying Shelley and Tennyson, but he invented other analogous devices for releasing his poetry to what he called the power of words. Some of the most striking moments in Israfel emerge when he punctuates its fantastical discourse with words from a decidedly low, even comic lexicon. In heaven a spirit doth dwell, whose heartstrings are a lute. None sing so wildly well as the angel Israfel, and the giddy stars, so legends tell, ceasing their hymns, attend the spell of his voice, all mute. Tottering above in her highest noon, the enamored moon blushes with love. Giddy, tottering blushes, the poetry is struck from unusual strings, a phrase that itself totters like the giddy stars at the edge of poetical decorum. At each of the poems moves, at each of the poems moves toward Israfel's transmortal heaven. It gets braked from soaring. Sometimes the brake is applied by an art of words that sink away from the ecstasies above, merrily live and long, sweets and sours, but Poe's unusual strings play with correspondent syntaxes, as we see in the elliptical form of lines 37 through 38. The ecstasies above, with thy burning measures suit, thy grief, thy joy, thy hate, thy love, with the fervor of thy lute. Well may the stars be mute. Even more striking is the interrupted syntax in the previous two stanzas. But the skies that angel trod, where deep thoughts are a duty, where love's a grown-up God, where the houri glances are, with all the beauty which we worship in a star. Therefore thou art not wrong, Israfeli, who despicist. Despicist. What the hell is despicist? Despicist, an unimpassioned song. Therefore, the word is doubly mysterious, partly because we can't see how it follows from the previous stanza, and that puzzle gets further complicated because the thought of the previous stanza, after careful syntactic elaboration, is left unfinished. Most arresting of all is the dazzling wordplay of Israfel's second stanza. Tottering above in her highest noon, the enamored moon blushes with love, while to listen the red levin with the rapid Pleiades, even, which were seven, pauses in heaven. I mean, that's not very good. I don't care what he's calling it, wordplay. That's not that good. It's pretty clunky, honestly. The lines start by troping on a recognizable astronomic event, the emergence of a reddening moon as it plunges into full lunar eclipse, which the poem later recalls as the shadow of Israfel's perfect bliss. Like the arrested lightning, the moon's color is a sublunar reflection of Israfeli's fire, which burns purely unaffected by our mortal atmosphere, somewhere even beyond the distant fires of the Pleiades. But they were the Pleiades. The initial, maybe that's just one Pleiades, is Pleiades. The initial tight image of a love-drunken moon is spilling into a set of end-skied images that are at once irrational, slightly ambiguous, and yet sharply defined. The complexities seem particularly rich, first of all because they are not based on contradictions, but on unexpected junctures created from shifting conceptual points of view that are acoustically defined. Even more important, the images strain against a pair of controlling formalities, the repeated end rhymes, and most of all, the involuted, pedantic syntax. The stanza is a wonder of unblemished affectation. This kind of poetic complex resembles nothing so much as one of Emily Dickinson's impacted poems, except that in Poe's case, we don't have to fight through a savagely elliptical syntax. As Poe's stanza flaunts its intention to literal clarity, once again the language is not symbolistic. Word references are set adrift, and we seem to glimpse unknown realities operating within the natural and quotidian order of things. The effect is achieved paradoxically because the poem covers such declarative precision, as in the opening stanza, after quoting George Sale's preliminary discourse to his influential scholarly translation of the Quran. The lines invoke more ancient authorities who have explained the effect of the spell of Israfel's voice on other angelic singers. Although the record of such legends is unpreserved by Sale or any other scholar, the poetic syntax uniquely declares their truth, first by a parenthetical aside and finally by a significant afterthought. The syntax is as cunning as it is careful. However, for all mute is a double appositive, referencing two figures of transmortal silence. So the method of Poe's poetry is less a function of what it means than of how it works. We have to parse with great care its procedural complexities, and in bottle bouncing, and in particular the regular play between its music-based versification and its prose syntax. Equally important is Poe's lexicon, which here, as so often, is drawn from the discourse of sentimental cliché and the popular culture of his period. A poem like El Dorado, for example, shows how much can be made by pressing a single rhyme on the poem's title and then running that rhyme through a series of attendant rhymes. The complex rhyming cluster keeps returning the reader to the poem's keyword, each time slightly shifting our angle of attention. This move argues procedurally that the word is what it appears to be, but that its appearances need careful attention. For a double historical meaning shadows the title word. One is quasi-legendary, the other is contemporary, and both are deeply American. Putting the reader to a test of those two meanings, the poem evolves a third meaning as a poetical undercurrent. The cliches of the opening couplet immediately reference the early plundering expeditions into the New World and the conquistador legend of a lost city of gold that grew out of those marauding adventures. All of that is slightly, but certainly, ironized by the obsolete language, and the illusion of the quest is plainly determined by the end of the second stanza. Running through those historical recollections is a parallel contemporary event. The poem was published in the spring of 1849. The California Gold Rush, 1848 to 1853, which the popular press was everywhere, calling the new search for El Dorado. We don't have to recall Poe's personal contempt for the gold rush craze to recognize the critical position the poem is taking toward a pair of his favorite subjects, self-delusion and crass American materialism. Even as those critical views have unfolded, however, the poem suddenly pivots at the beginning of stanza 3 when the adventurer's strength failed him at length. At that point, he meets his spiritual double, the pilgrim's shadow, and asks him where to find El Dorado. The shadow answers, over the